Good morning once again. We're excited that you're with us this morning, and we're always excited to be able to bring this to you, and we do look forward to that day when we come together in person again. But we just pray you're being uplifted and you worship God today, and amazing things are going to happen in your life when you trust God. Our scripture reading for today comes from Job chapter 19, verses 23 and 24. Where Job says, "Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in a rock forever." You've probably heard the term, dumb as a box of rocks. What does that mean? Is it a commentary on people or a commentary on rocks? Because the truth of the matter is, rocks or stones, they play a very important role in Scripture. We read a lot about them. You think about them, they were instruments of death and discipline. People were stoned. They used them to bury Achan and his family after he denied God and stole from the riches of Jericho. And yet they were used as a memorial when Israel crossed over the Jordan into the Promised Land. They put a pile of rocks as a memorial. There are a lot of things that we see in Scripture where rocks are used for and stones. Job makes it pretty clear that rocks are going to last longer than men. There's going to be rocks that are around long after we leave this earth, and they were here long before we were here. So today I want to look at rocks and what they do. And are they really as dumb as this saying says? So I want to start out by looking at how rocks provide safety. Rocks can shelter us from many things. Now I'm talking, of course, about the big rocks. Look at Isaiah chapter 33 and verse 16. And it says, "He will dwell in the heights. His refuge will be in the impregnable rock." Now, you may be familiar with rocks like this that are big, and you think you can't ever get to the top. People spend their life and people lose their life trying to climb rocks. They try to get to the top. One of the 7 churches we read about in Revelation is Sardis. Now, Sardis was a city of 2 parts. Down on the plain area, down on the plains, that's where the normal city was. That's where everyday activities happened. But when enemies attacked, there was a fort up on top of the rocks, up on the cliffs, and that's where they would go. And enemies would come, and they couldn't figure out how to get up there to Sardis. They couldn't figure out how to attack the people because they could not see anywhere in. And there's a story of how they finally accomplished that, but we're not going to get into that today. But it was an impregnable rock, and it provided them safety. It provided them shelter from their enemies. In Israel, whenever Israel was attacked by an enemy, they would run out and they would hide in the thickets. They would hide in amongst the caves, they'd hide amongst the rocks, anything that would give them protection. So rocks had this great purpose for people, to protect them from different things, and to be able to hold things up. Jesus said that rocks are a good foundation. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 25, and Jesus telling the story about the wise and the foolish builder, says, "The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock." Friends, it's important when you build anything to have a foundation. Otherwise, it's not going to stand. And that's the point Jesus was making. If you remember, the other part of the story was the foolish man built his house upon the sand. And you know what sand does when the water comes rushing in? It rushes out. But not only do you have to have a good foundation, you've got to be attached to that. I remember growing up in southeastern Ohio on Interstate 70, running toward Columbus. There's a little town, I don't know, it's called Baltimore or somewhere around in there, Kirkersville, right along the interstate. But there was a contractor there that built these houses, and he had model houses along the road that you could see from the interstate. Well, one day we got a massive windstorm that just pretty much followed the interstate. And we drove up through there shortly after that, and one of those houses, it was on a foundation of block, but it wasn't attached. And the house was setting off the foundation. You see, sometimes we have a foundation, but we don't attach ourselves to it. We have to be attached to that rock, and that rock, of course, is Jesus. You know, the audience, as Jesus spoke this story or told this story, they understood exactly what he was talking about because of the great storms that would come in from the west. And they would have a destructive force. And so they understood whatever we build, if we want it to last, we've got to have a strong foundation. We got to make sure that it's attached. It's the utmost importance. Without a foundation, it's probably going to fall. So we got to have that foundation. Then, of course, rocks also would provide shade for travelers. You know, living in the desert ourselves, we can understand that oftentimes there's only a rock around to provide shade or coolness from the blazing sun, or maybe just to be able to get behind it to block the wind. If you go hiking out on the trails sometimes, you have to find that rock to maybe lean against. But it provides something for you, something that can help you, because it can provide a semblance of safety, some sort of safety from wind and from storms. Now, Isaiah, in writing about the reign of King Hezekiah and talking about what kind of king he would be, he says in Isaiah chapter 32 and verse 2, each man will be like a shelter from the wind and a refuge from the storm. Like streams of water in the desert and the shadow of the great rock in a thirsty land. He's saying Hezekiah is going to make this a great kingdom, and he did. Hezekiah was a good king. He brought Israel back to God. Of course, we know the story of Hezekiah. We know how he prayed to God to extend his life. But he was a good king, and he did make Israel strong. He did make Israel a kingdom that people looked at and they would notice. Now, God used rocks in many ways. He used it to bring water to his people. You remember the story. As Israel is going to the promised land, they whined a little bit. Every turn it seemed like they had an issue. They had a problem. Well, then they get out and they're thirsty. They don't have any water. Moses turns to God and says, God, what do I do? These people are whining and complaining. There's no water and they're thirsty. What do I do? In Exodus chapter 17 and verse 6, it says, I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb and strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. Now, that's not something we usually think about a rock doing, supplying water, do we? But God said, I'm going to stand before you, and you strike that rock, and water will come out, and the people will be taken care of. And again, we see this in Numbers chapter 20 and verse 11. The people are complaining again about being thirsty. And so God tells Moses, you speak to the rock, have water come out of it, and we will make sure the people have enough to drink. And so Moses and Aaron go up and stand before the rock, and Moses strikes the rock and commands water to come out of it, and the water gushes out. That's not what God said to do. God did not tell Moses to strike the rock. He said, speak to the rock. But see, the water still come out, so you could say that even though Moses was disobedient, the rock was obedient to God. And by the way, this is the main event that caused Moses his opportunity to get into the promised land. Because God told him when he was showing him, he said, because you disobeyed me and did not glorify me back there, you're not going to get in. But that rock still obeyed God. The water still come out. The rock is also used as the foundation of the church. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18, Jesus says, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Friends, that's a great promise. So often we don't really pay attention to that end, understanding Satan cannot defeat the church. He tries. And he's going to try until the end of time. But Satan cannot defeat the church. But Jesus says it's on this rock, and it's not on Peter, even though his name technically is Petros, meaning stone actually. Jesus used the term Petra, meaning a large mass of rocks. And it wasn't on Peter that the church was built. It was on his confession. It was on the truth that we read earlier. When Jesus asked in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 16, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for man did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. He says, you know the truth. You understand the truth. You understand who I am. And upon that confession of the truth, I will build my church. People must believe that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. The Son of God. And that's the foundation of the church. Without Jesus being the Son of God, what hope do we have? I mean, think about it. That's our whole foundation. That he came from heaven, emptied himself, appeared as a man, and not only a man, but a servant, became obedient to death, even death on the cross. And that great love that he showed for us by dying on the cross, that's the foundation of everything we are. That's where the church is built. Upon that. Now, one thing we know about rocks, as we said, they're going to last a long time. They're solid. Yeah, we can break them. They can be destroyed. But yet, for the most part, rocks will last a long time. Remember our text, how Job wanted his words to be engraved in a rock with an iron tool? That was a common practice in the ancient Near East. Oftentimes, words were chiseled into stone, and then they were often filled with lead to make them shine and stand out. If you paid any attention to the first slide that I showed, there was a rock, and it said Erastus. This rock is in Corinth. And it is assumed that Erastus is the city treasure that Paul speaks about in Romans 16. And that rock is still there today. I saw it in it was there in 1996 anyway. But it's there and you can see it amongst the ruins there in Corinth. It's still lasting after all these years. after all the storms, after all the traffic. But it lasts forever, for a long time. You know, many of the buildings, the old buildings we see, they'll have a slab of marble or something with the name of the building or the year engraved in it. Because that rock is going to last. It's going to stand. Since Jesus is our foundation, He's the rock that's not going to change. He's the rock that's not going to give way. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. So when He told Peter back in Matthew 16, upon this rock I will build my church, it's still true today. Nothing has changed. It's still built upon that same foundation. Everything we read, it was inspired by God that men wrote down in the Bible, still true today. That is a wonderful, wonderful rock. A rock that will never give away. A rock that will never change. You know, when you think about how rocks can change over a long period of time, being exposed to the elements. And we may have witnessed it in rocks maybe around our house if we've lived there, you know, many, many, many years. You know, maybe you have a rock that was underneath a spouting that leaked or dripped. And after so many years, you may see a small indentation in that rock. That's not Jesus. He's never going to change. Nothing about Him will change. Now, we as people, we are called stones. I mean, we're called sheep, we're called stones. And what they have in common, if you believe our first comment, neither are very smart. I mean, sheep need a shepherd. Sheep need to be taken care of. Here in the Bible, we are called stones. And stones are just small rocks. Do we consider ourselves dumb? Well, we might say, I'm so dumb. But I don't think any of us think we're like a rock that can't think. That can't be logical. But see, we are stones with a purpose. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, Peter says, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And so here we are, we're these spiritual stones. We're building a spiritual house. But we're living stones. We're living stones because we're active and we're lively. Living means we have a purpose to accomplish. We come together as a body. I mean, we read about the church being a body in 1 Corinthians 12 and back in Romans chapter 8 back in there. Chapter 12 maybe. But we read about the church and the body and how we all come together, how God has given us the talents to glorify Him and to complement one another. We build a spiritual house. A spiritual house that's welcoming. Our purpose is to be priests that offer up acceptable sacrifices to God. Not in the way the Old Testament priests did. But in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 and verse 2 talks about how we don't conform to the world, but we live a life, a living sacrifice to God. That's how we build the spiritual house. And Jesus is the cornerstone. He's the one also that holds it all together. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 6 says, "For in Scripture it says, 'See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame.'" Now, there are people that make fun of those of us that believe in Jesus, that praise and worship God. But what Peter's talking about here, when he talks about will never be put to shame, I think he's referring to the one that really matters. God won't put us to shame. God won't ever get upset with us for glorifying Him, for doing what's right. But Jesus must be the cornerstone. You know, the cornerstone is where every building starts. That's the beginning. You don't start in the middle, you start with the cornerstone. And if you don't have a true cornerstone, then your building is going to be off. I mean, you may not think about it, but you figure if your cornerstone isn't true, and you start building, and say it's off maybe an inch, where are you going to be in 30 feet? Your building's going to be off. Jesus is the true cornerstone. And not only is He the cornerstone, He holds it all together. And that makes Him the keystone. Colossians 1:17 says, "He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together." Maybe you've seen a stone arch, and when you look right in the middle, there's usually a stone that's a little bit different shape. You pull that stone, chances are the whole arch falls in. That's the keystone. That's what holds it together. That's what Jesus is to us in the church. I mean, there's a lot going on in our world today. There's a lot of things that we get stressed out about, a lot of things that try to beat us down. We have this cornerstone. We've got this keystone. We've got this foundation we can rely on. We've got a rock that will protect us. He is our refuge in the storm. In Him, all things hold together. We just have to trust Him. Put our faith in Him. You know, and stones can be both good and bad. As we said, they were used as instruments of punishment and destruction. But here, if we look at Romans chapter 9 and verse 33, Paul writes, "As it is written, 'See, I lay in Zion a stone that causes men to stumble, a rock that makes them fall. And the one who trusts in Him will never be put to shame.'" Paul is quoting Isaiah 8:14 and Isaiah 28:16 here. But see, what that means is Jesus is out there. He is the stone that everybody has to deal with. We sing a song, "What will you do with Jesus?" That's a decision everybody has to make. Some people will consciously make the decision to follow Jesus. Some people will consciously make the decision not to follow Jesus. Some people will try not to make a decision at all. But you have to, because He's there. He is the cornerstone. And if you choose not to follow him, then he's no longer your cornerstone, he's your stumbling block. Why is that? Because he's going to challenge you every step of the way. Because your life is not what it should be without him. You'll trip and you'll fall. Jesus holds you up. Jesus is your foundation. But yet you don't have to follow him. Jesus never said, I'm going to command you to follow me. He said, here's the truth. Make your choice. Do what you should do. Just make a commitment. So Paul is pointing out both the good and the bad of stones. A rock of offense and a rock of hope. And Jesus is the same rock. It's just like he writes to the Corinthians when he says, to those who believe, we're the smell of life. But to those who don't believe, we're the stench of death. We're the same people. We're still believers. We're preaching the same word. To one, it's uplifting. To the other, and it's condemning. So it's not the message, it's the hearer. And that's the same as Jesus being the cornerstone. It's not that the cornerstone's bad. It's just, are you going to build on it or not? So I think we need to ask a question. How dumb is a box of rocks? I mean, after all, that's kind of what we are as Christians. We are put together to build this spiritual house. We're to be spiritual stones. So you could say we are a box of rocks. And since God's going to stand forever, and he knows who belongs to him, how dumb is a box of rocks? Our faith is in Jesus. And when we put our faith there, we will never be put to shame. Never. See, we can't be shamed when our faith is in the one who's victorious. The one who's won the war. Who's defeated sin and death. He's a rock. So I challenge you to be the rock that God has made you to be. And be immovable as he is immovable. Don't worry about what people say, what people think. Ours is to please God, to lift him up, to glorify him. Jesus is our firm foundation. And once we build on that, nothing can move us. And Jesus wants you to come and to build on him. He wants you to give your life to him. And you can do that by being baptized for remission of sins. And if you need to do that, contact us. We'll arrange that. If you need the prayers of the church, contact us. We'll arrange that. But I do ask that you go to God and pray and help him, or help you, to give you strength and courage. To give understanding what it means to be a spiritual rock. And never fear being put to shame, because it's not going to happen. Because Jesus is your rock, your foundation.